Finally, to our attendees who prefer to watch the talk at their own pace, you can find the sessions on Shuruq's YouTube channel, Shuruq SHJ. As humans started walking on Earth, religion, as told by history, has always been a point of reference, the backbone and the essence of human culture, regardless of what it was. And with time, people sought to create buildings in which they would practice their religion and pay tribute to their god. It may have started as buildings that were too sacred in a sense that only people of certain religious status were actually allowed in. Other cultures wanted to, if we may say, put the fear of God in people, so religious buildings started to get just bigger and bigger. Today, I think we can notice that scale is still quite an important aspect in many countries and culture, but sacred spaces are seeking to become more and more of a social space that reflects unity and spirituality rather than just being a place created to pray. So to join me in today's discussion about sacred buildings, I would like to welcome Yasaman Esmaili. She's an educator, architect, and founder of Chahar Studio, a multi-awarded studio with projects around the globe. Her work is focused on inward exploration and examination of existing presumptions in order to experiment with alternative design processes and create innovative and context-driven spaces. She believes that architects can play an important role in empowering the community and forming a social shift in the global society. We also have Ziad Jamaleddine, an assistant professor at Columbia GSAPP and co-founder and partner of L.E.F.T Architects based in Brooklyn and Beirut. L.E.F.T is dedicated to examining the intersections of cultural and political productions as they relate to the built environment. The firm has been recognized internationally with numerous awards, publications, and exhibitions for quality and excellence in design. So thank you both for participating in our talk, and I would like to leave the floor to you to give a brief introduction on your work as well and yourself. So maybe we can start with Yasaman, as ladies are always first.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for this opportunity. It's really great to be part of this discussion and to join something this great in a time that we're experiencing pandemic, and this is really valuable. So thank you so much, and I'm so honored to be here. I think you did a great introduction. So I'm an architect. I'm originally from Tehran, Iran, and I came to the US to study, and since 2 years ago, I started my practice at Studio Chahar, which works between Iran and the US, but really doesn't have a physical location. It's nomadic, and it's about collaboration and joining other people with similar interests in design and the community to do community-centered work. So the work that I do is about community, and I think that, and I also teach architecture, and I think that briefly describes it. Thank you.
Great.
Yes, hello everyone. Thank you, Najda. I would like to second Yasman for also thanking you for bringing us together to discuss such an important topic. I think not really well discussed or tackled in the public sphere today, or if it is, it's kind of simplified and reduced to stereotypes. So thank you for having us. I think, yes, you did the excellent introduction. Maybe I would just add that L.E.F.T is a partnership between myself and my partner, Makram Al-Qadi, who is in Beirut, and I'm in New York. And we do kind of find ourselves somewhere in between, not really in one or the other. So maybe that add to that experience that Yasaman has just mentioned. We also both teach. Makram teaches at the American University of Beirut, and I teach at Columbia University, as you mentioned. Mm-hmm. We've been lucky to work with religious architecture more so recently, and we also conduct research, let's say more scholarly research through the academic circle that we belong to on religiosity and the question of Islamic architecture.
Mm-hmm. All right, thank you both. So since you said you also conduct research and you're both scholars, I'm assuming research is a very important thing before beginning with any design or work to be done. So with regards to sacred buildings in particular, how does the research differ or does not from any other type of project, be it commercial or recreational or whatever kind of project there may be? Yasaman, maybe we start with you.
Sure. Well, so I think the main difference with religious spaces is that religious spaces are for everybody. It's for people, and it's not for a particular organization, which is kind of more similar to the other types of buildings that you just mentioned. Therefore, in terms of designing or thinking of the design process of religious spaces, it will start by studying what the particular community that we are trying to address are seeing the religion as, and what are their needs for that religious space. So I think more than any other type of building, it's really about discovering what the needs of the community is, because it can't have one main answer that can apply to all different definitions of religious spaces.
Agreed. So Ziad, would you like to add to that? Or?
Yeah, no, I totally agree that there is this intimate relationship between religious spaces and the community it's supposed to serve that an architect should really look at when thinking about religious and sacred spaces. But unfortunately, the practice is somewhere else. I know that everybody is trying to reconfigure and reconceptualize the practice so that it does that, kind of it carries that mission. But the practice today, between, let's say, building a house or housing and building a religious space differs quite a bit, unfortunately. And although it really should not, and for some reason, Islamic architecture more specifically finds itself as almost an outside discipline. So there is a history of architecture where we study housing and we study institutional building, public spaces, museum. And then there's another section called Islamic architecture that somehow does not belong to this larger history. And I think it's this, let's say, siloing the discipline, putting it somewhere else, make it much more difficult, I feel, for architects today to practice in a comprehensive way or with a deep understanding of the history of Islamic architecture or of the mosque more specifically. Because we find ourselves looking at those, I mean, from personal experience, when we were hired to design the mosque, we were, learning and looking at Islamic architectural book, which really start to define the building as a fixed building type that is historical, that belongs to certain period or certain typology, as if it never evolved in the 20th and 21st century. That's why you end up having a replication of those models as you see more mosques being built around the world. And I think this is the difficulty in the practice.
That's true, because if you think of other religions, you think of the building and then you see like it actually develops with the different types of, you have the Gothic architecture that influenced cathedrals, you have Art Nouveau, you have different types of principles, and it keeps on changing. But with the Islamic architecture, it's pretty much more or less until today, maybe it has been and stayed the same for a good amount of time.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's very true, as if it never evolved. And we don't say Christian architecture or Buddhist architecture, that we end up saying always Islamic architecture. And by that, we mean the mosque, which is that type that we recognize when we see it and that we should recognize. And I think you're right, there is less and less architectural innovation or experimentation when it comes to that building type today.
So in terms of a big aspect, I feel, of a religious space is spirituality. So Yasaman, what would you say defines spirituality in terms of architecture?
First, I just want to add that I also totally agree, especially about the use of term. I think that's something that has been so new for me when I first came to the Western world, the way that Islamic architecture is defined to categorize a whole, like many different countries and many different types of architecture as one. But to answer your question, I think the way that you described sacred spaces at the beginning of the talk, I think that was very true and great, because spirituality in terms of architecture, I think it starts, maybe it goes back to the time that we created dwellings. So it's really old. It's about the way that humans were trying to find a meaning and connect to their inner selves and to look beyond what is around and what is so easily achievable. So in order to kind of tap into that impossible, they try to create structures that would go beyond their own abilities. And that's why they could create types of structures that we even later we don't know how it was created, because it's about this collaboration and this work that would happen with many people who would selflessly just give, all they could give to create that structure or that phenomena that we would call it a religious space later. So it would kind of act as a gate to what is beyond. But I think, this is just like a very general meaning, but I think it's also very interesting that there are certain characteristics that we would find in almost all sacred spaces, that they have a sense of directionality, for example. It's about that direction that takes us to that gate. They have transcendence or verticality. They try to create perfect geometry and perfect detailing, because again, it's about achieving perfection, which for us would be defined by what the God could create. So as much as you can get closer to that, the better. It is about permanence and creating that sense of grounding, because you have to be grounded first to connect to the sky or to the other world, and which creates a sense of timelessness and creates a landmark. And I think also a more important, an important phenomena that's perhaps the one that we know of the most is about symbolism and iconography, because it's about the cultural aspects of how we again use symbols to define elements that are beyond us, and using those symbols in sacred spaces creates that sense of connection a lot better. So I think those are kind of like the main characteristics that we can find in most sacred spaces.
Yeah, maybe what I would add is, for me, spirituality also transcends perhaps kind of the religious specificity, which means any person can experience this when they walk into the sacred space, let's say, some kind of a feeling of that is beyond the worldly. I think that Yasaman was trying to describe it as well. And it has to do with the light of quality, it has to do with the geometry, it has to do with this spatial configuration and the way we occupy the space and use it. But maybe also regarding the sacred itself, I think it's interesting to question what is sacred, what is not, where does the sacred end, and where does the secular or the profane start, right? And that's also historically a very blurred line, even more specifically with historically the way the mosque functioned in the city, is that, the religious sometimes spills into the courtyard, into the city, and the space of the mosque is obviously a social space, secular in that sense. That does not have to deal only with liturgical function. So I feel that the religious building have the capacity to kind of perform the worldly, let's say, needs as well as the spiritual needs. And I think it's important to keep that in mind, because we're not only designing buildings that are isolated, but as Yasaman said, they're always part of a community that have needs beyond the liturgical function. They all come together within the space as a community, so it creates the social fabric, but they have other needs that the building also is able to provide to them. Exactly.
So how did you translate that into the design and execution of the mosque you worked on, the Amir Shakib Arsalan Mosque? So how was that created? How did it become this building that's holy and spiritual, and in every sense majestic, let's say, even if it's not this huge scale? But how is it still inviting? How is it still approachable? How is it still social, basically?
Yeah, so I think maybe is a good time to show some of pictures, I guess, right, of the mosque, and then I can talk about it a little bit more. And I also brought another example, more recent, let's say, as also try to push this ideas further. But the Shakib Arslan Mosque, sits in an area that is already multi-religious, so to speak, historically, even until today. It's not only Muslim community that occupy that part of the Lebanese mountain, also Druze community as well as Christians. So it's already sitting in a place where it's not only supposed to serve Muslims, let's say. And the Muslims, they're not the majority of that region more specifically. That's why, in a way, the building belongs to the road as well as to the fabric, the landscape fabric it sits into, because many people will be driving up and down this mountainous road and they will stop by the mosque to use it. So maybe to explain very quickly the architecture of it, and then I try to expand on the point that you have mentioned, which is there was an existing structure, actually, the 18th century existing structure that is here, that was not oriented to Mecca. And then the first thing we did is that we added this exoskeleton structure that is corrects, let's say, the orientation. And this is really all you need to kind of to fulfill the liturgical function. The other move that we did is that this area used to be a parking lot, which we then turned into what we call a civic plaza, with this 18th century pool that we also revived that was kind of out of function. And the way the two buildings sits together, the new and the old, so to speak, they create multiple exteriority with the concave and the convex geometry that we kind of mobilized, which means it creates multiple spaces that could be occupied on the interior without necessarily entering the mosque, and that could be used by other communities. Mm-hmm. So if this is just kind of a generic look, let's say, or a simple entry look of the plaza that could be expanded to be used on Fridays or on special event as an extension of the mosque. But also it's just a normal public space that could be used by anybody within the town or people who would stop by just to hang out outside the plaza, to kind of use the water fountain or the sabil that we provided just to drink water. And those people who will be using that kind of additional outdoor in between spaces, they don't have to be Muslim, neither do they have to enter the mosque itself. So in a way, the building is so porous and multi-exterior reality of it kind of provide kind of multiple usage or hangout, let's say, for the public beyond the specific user of the mosque, including here, I'm showing the roof of the building, which is now open and continuously connected to the lower plaza, to the upper plaza, next to a bed, a flower bed here that has actually thyme vegetation into it. The interior is also could be entered. Nobody's going to stop you in this kind of remote area. It's not a Friday mosque. This is a masjid. So anybody can enter, and you can see our attitude here is more an attitude of an abstraction of the space by kind of whitewashing it. And there are minimum signifier within the space. In this case, it's the orientation of the carpet and the mihrab, right? That kind of gives you the sense of what you need to do. But besides that, with the skylight that actually act as a chimney to ventilate naturally the space that you see there punched through the existing cross vault, is just almost like a chapel that anybody can use, walk in and sit on the carpet and hang out. And it has been used as such, maybe less than we would like it to be, but it is a remote area at the end of the day that you have to it's a destination, and it's not in the middle of the city. So it doesn't have the traffic or the large amount of people that will be using it. Maybe I would like to, if you don't mind, add one more project very quickly here that I think pushes this idea further. And this is actually our installation entry for the Sharjah Architecture Triennale, which happened last year, whereby we studied Sharjah's mosques, that most of which sit in this kind of isolated roundabout condition, really detached from the community they're supposed to serve. They have these large plaza in front of them. And our attitude was to kind of create a similarly exoskeleton or steel structure that would sit outside the plaza and almost create like a shaded sahan or courtyard condition. And our entry was really about simulating how this design of this canopy would perform outside the plaza, outside the mosque, how it fulfilled both liturgical needs of the mosque on the exterior and how it could shift during the day to kind of invite other people to use the space of the plaza. And this is a short video that I would run, and maybe I will speak over it. So the video basically simulates few scenarios. The canopy has these white line, which are kind of shadow line or light line that would kind of structure the space and would give you the proper orientation toward Mecca. So people will be coming slowly, kind of assembling along those lines and starting to pray until everybody is there. Let's assume this is a Friday a prayer. So now everybody is kind of performing it's performing the prayers and and all together. And then as the light shifts to the afternoon, it's kind of unlock other social activity that can take place within this community. And we've done kind of a survey and kind of groundwork, understanding how those spaces are used on the outside, and the lack of shade was one of the main problems, that the moment you have a tree or a simple canopy, people will start to congregate. In this case, what we did is that we coupled the plaza with a nursery of trees that you see here. And the afternoon activity will be almost like a gardening activity for the community. That they come together basically to take care of those trees. This is shifting to an iftar, kind of a night event, where some of those boxes that you see across the plaza, like here, here, and here, they kind of contain some of the minimum services needed to kind of unpack and have almost like a soup kitchen condition, or a little kitchen here next to the water fountain and ablution. So in that sense, it shifts back into some kind of religious or activities, and like every iftar is usually followed by some kind of form of congregation within the mosque, creating halaqat or rings around around those columns that people will be hanging out. This is now just shifting not only to the daytime, noon, but also to another season where the trees are much bigger. Now they're grown, and now there is kind of a new ritual that's being born, where people are moving some of those trees to the central courtyard, or moving it across the neighborhood, kind of creating more shades. So maybe, sorry, this is a bit too long, but this is kind of an example of how one can trigger, let's say, a transformation of an outdoor space so that it's able to open its doors, let's say, to the wider community beyond the one who uses the mosque, which is basically the intent here.
And thank you for sharing that, because what I love about it is that it points out the fact that you're actually utilizing the space, you know, more than the 5 times of prayer that we have during the day and night. So even in other religions, like it's usually, for example, condensed on a certain day, and then most of the other days it's not really utilized. And what do you do with this building? Do you just lock it, you know, up, or how does it work? And it's beautiful to see that there is more than one function, and there's basically a multi-purpose space that could be utilized for different activities that are even more social than, I would say, religious, but it's also religious in a sense.
Yeah, I mean, if I might add, it also opens itself to other demographic. It opens itself to families that could use the garden, or to more women who could be more engaged in this community activity. Because we know at the end of the day, the mosques are mostly a male space, at least the way it's practiced today. And this is try to challenge a little bit that boundary.
Yeah. And Yasaman, if I may move to the Hikmah, it's a religious and secular complex, and it also has different functions which you brought upon in the design, in the renovation process. So what can you tell us more about that, and about the same aspects of utilizing the building more, you know, throughout the day?
Yes, so first of all, thank you so much for the beautiful presentations. Yet I really enjoyed watching, you know, how the space was used. It was really great illustration. So I can't agree more, because especially in Islam, you know, when we look at historic examples, religious spaces in Islam, they were about bringing thinking and discussion and learning together with studying the religion. So that was kind of our main inspiration for Hikmah. So I can actually also start by sharing some images, and just to start, you know, by where the project started, where so this was an existing mosque which was built by late architect Falke Barbu from the region, who actually had received an Aga Khan Award for some of his other works in the region. And so my partner in this project, Mariam Kamara, who is the founder of Atelier Masumi based in Niger in the US, so she had she learned about this project, and she was informed that what is going to happen is that they're going to turn down this beautiful kind of older mosque because it wasn't in good shape, and instead the community wanted to build a much bigger mosque instead, because it was also not enough for the size of the community. It needed to kind of be a space for about 3,000 people in this village and in kind of 5 surrounding villages. And what happened through kind of like different sessions with the community, what the in order to save this kind of precious piece of architecture, the use that they actually came up with was to turn it to a library, which was a great idea, because then if this would be a library and if we could have a mosque next to it, which now I'm just gonna share the document that kind of, I would talk more about the project through that. So yeah, I just want to talk about the plan and how we kind of went with locating this. So this was the original mosque where it's located here. And so how it worked out was that we went ahead and with the community, we decided to place the new mosque next to the library and kind of create a campus, which we called it the Minds Garden. So a place for the minds to meet and discuss, and also to bring what Ziad was talking about, to bring secular thinking next to religious thinking. So this really was also the goal, that this would be a place for discussing knowledge next to religion, and it would also be for all members of the community. It wouldn't be for men only, because now the library would be used by women and also by children. And so throughout the process, so these are some pictures of, for example, the sessions that we had with community members, with school children, to kind of ask them what kind of spaces they would need. We also talked to women. They asked for spaces for creating different crops in the garden space. They also basically described their needs in the sessions that we had with them. So by bringing those social spaces in the garden area around the library, and by bringing the study spaces into the library, what we could achieve was to bring these uses next to the new mosque and create a space for the exchange. So this is a picture of the new mosque, and this is a picture of the renovated old mosque, which is now a library. We added some classroom spaces. We added garden areas for workshop, and we added even areas for, having different kind of settings for children to play. So this place now doesn't act only for religious reasons. It also acts for children, for studying, and for women. And these are just some more images of the project that I can also, you can also see that, again, it acted as a place for gathering for women, which I think there might be, other questions that we're going to address those, which I will talk about those aspects later.
It's really great to see, an actual socially inclusive design. It involves different genders, different age groups, and this is what religion is for all. So why are we targeting certain demographics or certain, ages and things like that when we design it? Actually for all, just like you've done. So it's really great examples that you shared, both of you. When it comes to the architectural language, Ziad, let me ask you, how is contemporary architecture looked at from the people? Is it, when it comes to religious buildings, we're very used to Islamic architecture being all about geometry and all about Islamic shapes. I don't know, we call them that, but I'm not sure what defines them in that way. And then you both went ahead and had more of a contemporary twist to it. So how is it accepted? Is it rejected by the community? How is it treated, basically?
Yeah. That's a great question. I just want to mention one thing also on the Yasaman project, which is the fact that the radical move, which is to turn the mosque, the existing mosque has moved, right? It's not the sacredness of the mosque almost moved with the new structure, and where it became just an empty shell that you can appropriate, which means that and you're dealing with a community that appears to be much more permissive in allowing this to happen, because usually community clings to that space of worship and it's sacred can never be transformed or moved, and you literally kind of moved it next door. I think this is a really kind of amazing gesture.
Yes, well, and it happened because they decided on it themselves, so we didn't kind of impose.
So there was a consensus of kind of doing this move, which I think is, I mean, in any architectural history term, that's very radical, because usually what is sacred forever, assumed to be, let's say, a property of God, which is the way the Waqf actually is defined. And in this case, but the Waqf was also allowed the exchange of property, right? So the sacredness kind of is much more fluid than the way we think about it today. And maybe this ties into the question of language, because if you fix the space, then you fix its architecture. If you say this is sacred forever, the mosque, the Ottoman mosque, the dome, the minaret, the courtyard, the 4E1, all these typologies that we learn about, if you associate this architectural resolution or this architecture with a fixed concept of sacredness, then in a way you're fixing also the architectural language. I think the moment you unlock the two from each other and you understand spirituality and sacredness as a spatial practice that has to do with the community, with its needs, with their spiritual need as well as their worldly needs, I think then the repertoire is much larger. You can basically really experiment with architectural language, with materiality. You can look at the question of labor. You can look at environmental question of the material you're using, who is building it, where it's coming from. And you can tackle much more issues that are much actually affecting communities today, including environmental and social problems, through this architectural language that you have the space to experiment with. So the moment I think we understand the mosque as continuously evolving and mutating and developing, and in fact, the historical mosque was never one building form. It was always, let's say, hybridized and tempered with other cultures that Islamic civilization interacted with. In that sense, it kept on evolving. So if we assume the evolution is at the center of that building type, then you are really free to take it to the next level and experiment with a new formal language, with a new geometry that responds to the needs that 21st century, let's say, needs that communities today are facing. I think in Mukhtarah, one important thing that drove the architectural language is that we wanted to produce first the existing structure was renovated by local masons that we worked with. There was also the sabil, or the fountain, was connected to a natural canal that we also worked with the local kind of hydrologists to channel the water in gravitationally, and then it goes back into the canal. So many of those localized renovation were dealt with the local community and its own capacity and labor. And then this steel structure was produced in the city, fabricated while the building was being renovated. We were fabricating the steel structure. And the moment the renovation of the existing was done, it took us only 2 days basically to drop in, crane in the existing structure, which saved time. It also saved on the kind of economy of the expense of the building, etc. And for us, it was about creating more shade and more outdoor spaces. So in a way, all of these criteria came into the thinking, how to kind of reinvent the mosque. I mean, it has mosque spirit in it. You can see a minaret because they ask us for a minaret. You can see there's no dome, but there's an inverted dome, for instance. It's not a cube, it's kind of exploded. So it has multiple exteriors, as I described earlier. And then maybe one point that we would like to bring up is the question of ornament, because also ornamentation has been looked down at historically, that the building, Islamic building, they confuse ornament. You don't know where the structure is, let's say comparing to Gothic architecture or any other religious architecture where the rational kind of column expression is very much part of the language. Here you probably noticed, we inscribed in this thin steel structure 2 words, Arabesque word, the word Allah on the minaret and the word al-insan, or the human being, on the plaza wall, which the pixelization of the structure reinforced, of these 2 words reinforced the structure and made it structurally, let's say, sound, right? So here we were also experimenting with the idea of confusing or conflating ornament with structure, so you don't know where ornament ends and where the structural logic starts of the building, which also, of course, has other meanings, the word, the human being, and the worldly kind of facet of the building, and the humanism, the history of humanism, which is often forgotten in Islamic theology. And of course, the word Allah, which is kind of embraces the minaret.
And I feel like in a way, you've yes, it's contemporary, yes, it's different, not what people are used to, but I feel like you kind of tapped into people's emotions by, putting these two words and the calligraphy, Allah on top of the minaret, and then man or a human basically on the entryway. And then also the addition of these spaces, the civic plaza, all these things. I feel it's difficult to actually reject such a, it does tap into people's emotions in a way.
Thank you.
So, and Yasaman, the way I see the Hikmah building, it's very, very respectful to the context. So yes, it's contemporary in a way, but it's the materials, everything that has been used, it looks like it really belongs there, and I feel like that's an important aspect to making people accept it. I don't know if you agree.
Well, definitely. I mean, it's kind of like to add to what Ziad was talking about in terms of how in Islamic architecture, we don't see, a lot of change. I think it's not only about religious buildings. I think it's about maybe, all types of architecture in certain part of the world that we would call the Islamic world, is that maybe, in the way that we define the Western change in terms of style, we haven't experienced that. We think of it very differently, I think, in different parts of what we would call the Islamic world, or countries where the practice of Islam is the most common. And kind of like keeping that in mind, the way we saw the process of design for this building was kind of similar maybe to the way that we would see the process of designing of any other type of a structure. And that's why we really started by studying the typologies, the local typologies a lot. And again, I think this also kind of goes back to the fact that when you look at these examples in different parts of the Islamic world, they will be very different, right? There are certain commonalities. There is certain program, the praying towards the mihrab, that maybe would be the common aspect of all religious and mosque spaces in the Islamic world. But then the way that the spaces are made, it can be really different in different parts of the world. So we looked at many different examples, and here you can see a few examples of the mosques in the region, like the first two on the left. And so this one is the plan of the original mosque, which we turned to the library, and this is the plan of the new mosque. So we actually took a lot of the characteristics of the existing typologies. And of course, the result is different because we are dealing with different types of tectonics. So the old mosques that we found, the typologies, they're all adobe mosques. Our structure is made of compressed earth blocks and concrete. It can create a much larger structures, and it will have sharp edges. So it won't have this kind of more softer forms that you will see in many of these examples. However, we also kind of having the double space. We also have one minaret, which most of these examples also had one minaret. We have evolution spaces and a courtyard space. So there's a courtyard and there are evolution spaces, and that's how you enter the mosques. So the image, the ending result might look very different from the historic examples because the tectonic of the time required us to use different types of materiality. But the way that people would use this space would be a lot similar to many of the examples that they have in the region. And I think that's probably the reason that it really could feel that this, one observer could feel that this space belonged to this community or the region that it's built in.
So before I move to Ziad, since you were discussing community and having that sense of belonging, so in particular for women, because you focused a lot about how women are encouraged to use the space in the Hikmah complex. Usually in the design of mosques, just like we were saying in the introduction in the beginning, women are more encouraged to kind of worship at home. So in general, the dedicated space for them in mosques are usually smaller, but then sometimes during certain times, for example, Ramadan or in certain days or Eids, a lot of women actually want to go and pray in the mosque, and sometimes it's not sufficient. And sometimes also the environment itself is not, it's not designed for them really. So how is that answered, whether it's in Hikmah or it should be answered in other in mosques in general? Yes.
Yes, sure. Yeah, I think that's actually a very, very important question, and it's a very sensitive issue. I don't think there is one answer to it, because in each community that, again, we would work with in many different countries that we would see, for example, Islam or other religions being practiced, women of that particular community would see their role in a different way, and they would need what they would need would be different from other communities. In our particular case, in Hikmah, through the sessions that we had with the women, what we knew was that they wanted space next to the library to kind of study there, first of all, because they wanted to have literacy courses. So it's not only for the children, and we knew that they needed a space to kind of do their workshops for their crafts and have community space for them together. In this particular region, actually mosques are only used by men. It's not used, the examples that we saw, they're not used by women at all. So we didn't think that we can impose the use of the mosque to women. That wasn't our goal. What we thought was that, okay, at least the step that we can take is that women and children can be in this campus next to the mosque building. But in the planning of the building, we have two spaces. We have one bigger one and one smaller one. We were not initially thinking that the smaller building would be, which is kind of a 400 square meter room, the smaller prayer room would be used by women. But what happened automatically was that after they kind of claimed their spaces in the library, women also claimed the smaller room. So automatically, because they came nearby, they also came to the mosque, and which was great. So I think this happened because we worked with them from the beginning, and they were part of the process, so they felt that they belong to the space.
Can I add something to this? I think it's a really important conversation. I mean, I think it's amazing the way they appropriated the space, because basically almost allowed for this to happen. You didn't force it. You just allowed the possibility for it to happen, and then it happened quite naturally. I think this is really a great way of thinking about design, not to kind of top down. This you should all be sharing. Because maybe I want to say two things. One is that I think addressing the question of women in the space of the mosque is probably the challenge of our century. Maybe hopefully it will be resolved. The challenge of our basically generation. Let's say it's something that we have to tackle and we have to address. And if we don't, then we're really not we're doing a disservice to the Islamic community, whatever they are. But having said that, I totally agree that it is not something that one can go one way and enforce kind of what we believe, our system of belief. On the community, you have to kind of be in negotiation and understanding. And there are subtleties in the way the community expresses itself also. Like, it's not like they're gonna say, yes, we want it. There are other means and the other ways that this dynamic between the different gender, let's say, unfold in a community. And I think we have to be sensitive enough to understand that and try to respond to. In our mosque, what we did is we started with this idealized space. Like, it was a tiny mosque. It has 2 entries. We did 2 ablution areas, and we said man, woman enter from each, but they found themselves in the same space. And it worked like that for a while, until we heard some objections, basically, that no, maybe, that's not always how it's going to happen. So we eventually designed like a screen, unfoldable screen, lightweight, that is sitting in the space. And that basically allows the user to basically decide if they want to be separate or if they want to share. They just simply put up the screen or remove it. There's no hierarchy between front and back, just a screen that divides the space into. And I think this is how we try to basically address it retroactively, let's say. But it's definitely a critical question for us and for mosque design today. And because the default solution is it's a man mosque with a screened area, small area for women. And this is how it's been implemented basically everywhere. And I think that's a bit of a problem.
Yeah, definitely it needs more architects and designers like you to actually listen and, do something about it rather than just design it the way it has been designed for a long time. So it's great to hear that you're both incorporating that in your work. Okay, speaking of also, yes, we tackled women and we tackled the same religion, like Islam, for example. But Ziad, what do you think about multi-faith spaces? There are a lot of them that are coming up with time now, and it's being used in different spaces, whether it's very small, for example, in an airport, or even a lot of designers have actually pitched places where there is more than one building that is dedicated for a different religion. How would you go on about designing that? Respecting the sensitivity of each religion, the privacy, the spirituality, and so on?
I think this is a really difficult question, but I will try to answer. The problem maybe is the multi-faith. I'm not sure what multi-faith means. Is it and the difference with interfaith? I think we have to really deconstruct those words and understand them. But what I'm more confident with is looking at the history of architecture of the mosque. There are plenty of evidence historically where a space has been either shared by different religions or changed hands from one religion to another. And the perfect example, we all know the Umayyad Mosque in Damascus, which was built on the Roman god Jupiter temple, and on top of the John the Baptist Basilica that came after the temple on the same exact site. And today the mosque in its final form, it's actually almost an amalgamation of those two buildings before it. The perimeter wall is the Roman wall, and then the arcade on the insides are the arcade of the basilica, kind of recycled within the new space of the interior space of the mosque. So we have a building here that talks about this multi-religious. I don't know if it's multi-faith, because we also know that at a certain point early in the history of the building that it was shared by both Christians and Muslims, because where the Umayyad civilization capital was Damascus was still majority Christian at the time. So it was shared. The temple courtyard was shared by both community, and then the Islamic community grew. So the Christian moved out, and then they had some kind of a deal in exchange. They protected other churches. They gave away their church. So there was some kind of a dynamic relationship between the two communities, I think, at the time. Now the Umayyad Mosque today, in its current configuration, still has John the Baptist shrine inside nested within the colonnade of the mosque, which is visited by tourists. And it also has, although it's a Sunni mosque, as we know, it also has a Shia shrine for Al-Hussein, which is also sitting around the courtyard visited by Shia community. So that's a space, and the way it's practiced today, it is shared by 2 or 3 different communities. But it's also, those communities, not only they come and use their own shrine or praying area, they also mix within the courtyard of the space. So we have here an example of, maybe it's multi-faith, we can call it, but definitely a form of the dynamic interaction between different religious groups. So there are precedents, and there are other precedents. Of course, similar to that, where these things happen. Now, if I may share a project that we are working on now, and it's actually in its early schematic phases. I want to, this is just very quickly, this is the Umayyad Mosque today. If you see at the legend, this is a beautiful drawing because it shows the legend. He shows kind of the making of the building, different periods that came together to create this final architecture resolution. And then you can see here the John the Baptist shrine, and then the Shia shrine of Al-Hussein, which out here. But I want to go back to what Yasaman was saying earlier. Today we're working on, here in the US, in Vassar College, which is a small college upstate New York, on their Center for Religious, Spiritual, and Contemplative Practices. It's basically a student center for different religious groups to share that building. There's an existing structure we're working with. But the first thing we did is maybe a little bit what Yasaman was doing is actually have some form of open forum and participatory approach, which is basically meeting those more than 13 different religious and non-religious spiritual groups that exist on campus, putting them all in one room, and had a series of mapping exercises and workshop trying to understand how they would like to share that space, who would want to use it at what time, what can they share in terms of common, sharing the kitchen. What does that mean to have a halal kitchen within a kosher kitchen, but also that respond to a vegetarian diet, but there's also somebody in the room who has allergies, right? I mean, this is a kitchen that needs a lot of work and thinking that in order to resolve and address those different needs. And that for me is interfaith, because that's different people from different religious beliefs trying to share one utility here. In this case, it's the kitchen. So we did a series of workshops looking at the building within its site, looking at the building itself, within how it could be planned and organized on the interior, with plenty of ideas that came out of this. And what we learned, and these are some of the mapping exercises that we did, what we learned is what Yasaman was saying earlier, is that instead of looking at the religious institution and at the authority and the way they prescribe religious practices, we were actually looking at the lived experiences of those students and the way they interpret those belief system of belief and the way they practice it in space. And what we found is actually that they are much more, of course, talking about the newer generation, we're talking about, university campus. So you're talking about much more progressive and permissive dynamic, that they don't mind praying in the same space or sharing the same space, right? So we had specific question, for example, to the Muslim community. What if there's a cross in the room? You accept that, or do you have to take it away because you're sharing one room? And basically the answer was, as long as I'm not praying towards it, that's not a big deal. It could be anywhere in the room. And of course, historically, mosque had mosaics of Virgin Mary, and because of course it's Islam see Christianity as people of the book, and it's one theological evolution, right, from Christianity, Judaism. So this idea of one community coexisting within the other with a kind of small sense of negotiation is very doable as long as we kind of understand it. And I think this is where the community engagement part of those projects are essential. I'm just gonna show a few pictures how the building evolved. We created this path, almost like a circumambulation, like a tawaf idea around the building, along which we had a series of paths that are shared by different religious groups. I'll just give you one example. This would be the path that was shared by the Muslim community, the Jewish community, and the Quaker, Christian Quaker. And the architecture of this is monolithic enough that it doesn't belong to one group or the other, but within it, there are minimum signifiers that allow them to perform their function. I think it was mentioned before, this would be the orientation towards Mecca. This will be the orientation towards Jerusalem for the Jewish community, and the square configuration allows the Quaker basically to have their meeting groups, which happen usually in square. That's it. I'll stop here.
I just wanted to add something, because I think that this was great, because when you were talking about, multi-religion spaces, the first thing that I thought about was there is, this old intersection in Tehran. It's an urban space, but then there's, in a corner, you have a church. Next, in the other corner, there is a mosque. Then there is a Zoroastrian temple, and then there is a Kanisa. So all those four are living in a square. And I think there are many examples in Lebanon as well of similar intersections. So I think that was great, that could actually translate itself into one space as well, if the people can actually accept it. So I think once people want it, it's possible.
Yeah, and for me, it was very enlightening to see the importance of participatory design. Just like you were saying, if people want it, then definitely. And in a way, it brings people together. Religion has been, throughout history, treated as something that is other than what it should be, as a division, when it's actually, it should be, united. Even if people are from different faiths, we should respect each other and treat each other in the best way possible. And examples of these buildings, and that people actually are open to it, I feel like it just makes us feel better of a, the future is hopefully better. So that's great. I personally really enjoyed this discussion. Honestly, I don't know if we have time to even answer maybe quickly one question from the audience, which I thought was interesting. It's basically about the orientation of a building. So for example, for us, the building, the orientation is very important that it's towards Mecca. And then in architecture as a whole, sunlight is also another important thing. So how can you combine both? How can you still have, and sunlight could be a symbol of spirituality as well, like natural light basically. So how can you respect both? Ziad, maybe because since you have the skylight and since
yes. I mean, this is a great question. I didn't show at the beginning. I had brought a map that we drew, which kind of maps more than 50 mosques in one continuous drawing. And what you learn from that is there's something very interesting about the mosque, and I'll talk about orientation in general, is that the mosque has a worldly reference point, right? All mosques across the world point to Mecca. They don't point to the sky or to some other realm, right? They all point to Mecca. And if you think about it geographically, naturally what you have in every region, a mosque will have a different relationship to the sun, because it's shifting and moving around Mecca, which means the quality of those mosques as you walk around the globe or around Mecca, they have different spatial and light quality that is specific to their location. And I think this is what makes spirituality kind of worldly in that sense, is that if it did not have this worldly reference point, which is Mecca, it would not have this variety of light quality within the mosque. Now, having said that, the mosque originally was, orientation was toward Jerusalem, and then it shifted towards Mecca. And then even throughout time, they did not know how to really orient towards Mecca until we had more scientific knowledge that started to correct the orientation. So that's why some of the beautiful mosques in in Egypt, they started one angle, and then as they grew, you see them kind of adjusting it, rotating it. The Ottoman took it on their own kind of task to define wherever you are in the Ottoman world, this is the angle that you should follow to properly. So there was kind of scientific adventure there, or inquiry, in order to find the correct orientation towards Mecca. So I think the orientation is really an exciting topic to think about. It's more complex than its one-liner. And of course, other religions have also orientation either toward Jerusalem or to the east, with certain Christian religious sect. And others don't. They just kind of, the way they configure themselves within the space is enough.
Yasaman, would you like to add?
Well, sure. I mean, the only thing that I totally agree. And what I would add is that in terms of lighting in the mosque, at least like how we saw it in this particular project, which I should have started by saying that it really depends on where you're working in terms of the climate and how you would deal with the sun in this particular climate, because we didn't want a lot of sun in the space climate-wise, physically, to kind of keep the space cooler. We also, but at the same time, we wanted to kind of help with that sense of indirect light that would create a sense of being, again, connecting to the beyond, seeing some light, but not knowing where the source is coming from. That's why the way we saw it was that we tried to kind of address the lighting in a very indirect way. And again, with the question, with the aspect of the directionality that Ziad was just talking about, to kind of keep the focus on the direction of the mihrab, but kind of being washed with some indirect light that would come to you from different directions.
We had a similar experience also working in the Muhtara Mosque, Amir Shakib Asma, which is we realized as we were talking to the religious authority that actually there's a leeway also. I'm not sure if, I would love to know from Yasaman if they have this, like there's a 15 degrees plus or minus you can be off, and that's acceptable. So there is this gray area actually that talks about a much more fluid understanding of all those criteria that we take on when designing a building. And I think once you realize that it's much more flexible and negotiable and open-ended, I think it really opens the imagination to new building forms.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I'm afraid our time has come to an end. Honestly, I really, really enjoyed this session. It's been a pleasure, and I personally learned a lot. And I'd like to thank you both for your participation. And on behalf of Shuruq's team, on behalf of both of you and myself, I'd like to thank our attendees for joining us. Is there anything else you would like to add just before I wrap this up?
Sure, I just want also to thank you so much for having me here. I learned a lot as well, and I really enjoyed this discussion. Thank you to everybody who is listening to this.
Yeah, I would like to second that. Thank you for having me and having this exciting conversation. Also, thanks everybody for listening. I think it's really an important conversation that we're having today. Kind of to enrich a little bit the public debate when it comes to this topic. And I think this is a really great start. Thank you.
Of course. So thank you all, and mark your calendars for our upcoming session on the 8th of December. The title is Bridging the Gap. And until then, everyone stay safe and goodbye. So bye, take care.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you.